In a time of hypocrisy, duplicity and hysterics, let's keep focused on the right thing to do, which is for the Syrian government and its Russian ally to end the war, by finally defeating the terrorist gangs holding out in their last stronghold of Idlib province. The Syrian government of President Assad has the sovereign legal and moral right to vanquish the terror groups that have marauded and brutalized Syria for the past 8 years. These militants are not some kind of pro-democracy uprising that the Western governments and their news media have been absurdly lionizing. The last treble-held area is a lie that Western media continue to spin, albeit with ever-increasing transparency as a lie. Such spinning is a travesty of the truth. The militants in Idlib are the assorted terrorist gangs that the Western powers, primarily the United States, have been arming as their criminal proxies to overthrow the Syrian government. There are no moderate rebels, the militants are vile terrorist mercenaries, who nearly succeeded in turning Syria into another failed state for the sordid satisfaction of Western powers and their imperialist machinations in the Middle East. The principled military intervention by Russia to aid the Syrian state averted the catastrophic fate that befell other countries where the US and its allies have despoiled for regime change. The Syrian army is now in a position to finally eradicate from its country the Western-backed jihadists. Syria and its Russian ally must now proceed to finish the task of ridding the country of the terrorist disease that Washington and its criminal partners infiltrated. All the sound and fury from the US, Britain and France, amplified by the Western media, should be ignored with contempt. Their protests against the looming offensive to retake Idlib is rank hypocrisy. Washington and its allies are decrying a humanitarian crisis ahead of the Syrian offensive. This grotesque hypocrisy is uttered by Western powers which have fomented a covert war by weaponizing terror groups. Their weasel words also come as US-backed Saudi warplanes relentlessly carry out a slaughter of civilians in Yemen. The doublethink and moral duplicity is astounding, and should be repudiated. The criminal Western governments have no authority whatsoever to pontificate to Syria and Russia about humanitarian casualties. In any case, the Syrian and Russian forces have operated to relieve humanitarian suffering in Syria by breaking siege after siege imposed by heinous terror groups holding civilians under a reign of terror. The clearest example of this so far was in the liberation of East Aleppo in December 2016. Tens of thousands of civilians were relieved from the head-chopping moderate rebels when the Syrian and Russian forces retook Aleppo. Today, the people of Aleppo have begun to repair their lives in peace. Prior to the liberation of Aleppo, Western governments and media were hysterically condemning the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force for war crimes and creating a bloodbath. That hysteria was shown to be lie. Aleppo, like many other cities and towns, was liberated and restored to peace. The Western governments and the media say nothing now about Aleppo because the reality totally disproves their deceitful posturing. The same lies are being spun today about Idlib. Although there is a sense that the Western powers know their mendacious narrative of bloodbath is wearing thin. Syria and Russia would do well to shun the hypocritical protests, and proceed to do the right thing, which is to destroy the last remaining terrorist bases in that country, and thus permit a comprehensive peace to be established. It is incumbent to mention the odious role of the United Nations here. UN chiefs have indulged the Western powers by talking up the charade of humanitarian concern. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, and his special envoy Staffan de Mistura have been deploring the planned Syrian offensive. They're calling for talks. This is while Turkey is reportedly increasing the supply of weapons to the militants in Idlib, and while the US, Britain and France are threatening military attacks on Syria. Guterres and the other UN bureaucrats would be better off making unequivocal condemnations of the US-backed genocide in Yemen. But on that Channel House they seem to have little to say in the way of specific condemnation. All the pious, double-dealing concern about Idlib is in reality a reprehensible attempt to buy time for the terrorist gangs holed up in the province. Why aren't the mealy-mouthed UN chiefs calling the US, British and French threats to attack Syria what they are, which is a crime of aggression against a sovereign nation. There are U.S. media reports that the Trump administration is considering launching airstrikes on Syrian army and Russian military positions in Syria if there is an escalation. What for? To protect civilians? To protect rebels? No, the NATO powers are willing to go to war in Syria to protect remnants of the terror army they deployed covertly over the past 8 years for criminal regime change. Washington and its allies, the Western media and the UN leadership are a disgrace. They have no moral authority. Not a scintilla. The US seems willing to start World War III, if it attacks Syria and its Russian ally in order to defend terrorists in Idlib province. Former presidential candidate Ron Paul has openly condemned the Trump administration for siding with al-qaeda. Syria and Russia must not be deflected, intimidated or blackmailed by Western governments, their media and UN flunkies, who are no better than the terrorists whom they are, in effect, aiding and abetting. The task to defeat the arrayed nefarious forces assaulting Syria is a righteous one, and must be courageously completed.